welcome to the third ever Kong community call. My name's Judith. I'm the developer marketing manager here. And we have a pretty packed schedule today, so I think we're just going to get into it. So this is November 13th. And today we have Dennis Kelly here, who's going to present a Terraform module that he built while he was at Zillow that deploys Kong. And we have Mars Hall, who's going to present his Heroku app. So without any further ado, Dennis, do you want to go first?
Sure. Happy to share my screen here.
Awesome. Let me stop sharing, and then I think it will release it to you. Nice.
So here I'm sharing just a standard terminal, and I'm in a directory called Kong that I've set up as a Terraform directory. The first file, main.tf, is typically used to just provide for the provider information. And so here I'm saying I'm building this in AWS. I specify a region, which is US West 2, close to Seattle in Oregon. And then I have the actual Kong module itself. And so here I'm calling the module from GitHub, and this is hosted by the Zillow group in Kong Terraform. And as it stands right now, I would be running this off of master, but we do version this so that you can lock in at a version and not take incremental updates that would then change your infrastructure. And there's plenty of examples online on how to do that. And so I think the current release is version 2.1. And with this example, this is like the bare minimum that you would need to define in order to deploy a full Kong cluster in AWS. And what this is going to provision for you is an Aurora cluster for Postgres for the Kong database backend and configuration, and then EC2 instances for the Kong nodes themselves, and then load balancers both excuse me, internally and externally in order to have access to internal facing resources such as the GUI or the admin API, but then you wouldn't want to expose those to the internet. So we would only be exposing the Kong gateway itself out to the internet. And then you can additionally include tags that you would use for, say, auditing and billing purposes in AWS. And so that's the very basic piece of it. I then want to go over to the Kong module itself and GitHub, and we'll do some exploring over here. And so here you can see all of the resources that will be provisioned for you. In addition to what I have already mentioned, there will be like auto-scaling groups for the EC2 instances so that as your load increases, you can add additional instances into your cluster, or you can also scale back. And there's also some additional information about what AMI is used and how everything gets provisioned. But then if we look at this variables file here, these are all the variables that you can pass into that Kong module to fine-tune your own specific environment. And so you can see there are public and private subnet tags that we rely on within the VPC, so that way you're not statically coding that into your Terraform. So if you say rebuild your environment and those subnet IDs change, you're just relying on the tags to rebuild your cluster. There's also access control blocks that you can tweak for, say, your Bastion host. If you wanted to admin Postgres or admin Kong outside of the cluster itself, you could add those in, and the security groups would provide access to them. And then these are the required tags. Most of them are provided for you. This is used to label all the resources in AWS. And so by default, if you look at the load balancers or the EC2 instances that are provisioned, they're just going to be called ZG-Kong-2-1. And then we supply the environment. And so in my example, it would be prod. And then it supports both the community and enterprise edition. So here's a flag to enable the enterprise edition. It's just true or false. And then you have EC2 specific settings. Again, all of these are tweakable. And then also with the Kong packages. And so the latest versions that I had tested were the Kong Enterprise 0.31 and 12.3. Obviously, that's a little behind the times now, but for all intents and purposes, it should easily upgrade to the other editions just by overriding the package name. And then you can also tweak things like the load balancers. Like, say you wanted just an internal Kong cluster. You don't have to expose that to the internet, and you can enable or disable that load balancer just by a Boolean value. And again, I'm trying to provide sane defaults to where it makes your Kong module very small. But again, you can go in and override health check settings to tweak them for your environment. If you have specific needs that would say you would want to drain connections longer, or you would want to wait longer before considering something unhealthy, you can go in there and tweak them. And then we do have CloudWatch alarms so that when you have a threshold of 4x or 5x errors, you can alert on those and use CloudWatch actions for them. And so a good example of that would be defining an SNS topic that linked to PagerDuty, so that if you hit your thresholds or if a node goes unhealthy, you could page on those events. And then again, the same thing, you can tweak everything with the database settings as well, and also with Redis. And so all of those are just values that you would then pass back into the Kong module that you saw earlier in the shell screen. And so again, here I have an example here where I define some additional values where I don't necessarily have to explicitly enable the internal load balancer, but I did just for example's sake. So once you have things defined the way that you want, all you then have to do is run Terraform init plan and then apply, and that will provision all the resources for you. And this is security groups, the load balancers, all the nodes. Your Kong cluster will come up healthy within about 10 minutes because the Aurora clusters do take some time to provision. While that's provisioning though, it's important to go into the AWS console, into the parameter store. That's where a lot of the secrets are kept, encrypted. And that this way, none of that ends up in your Terraform or in your Terraform state, which would then be maybe pushed back to a repository and available in plain text. And so while the Kong cluster is provisioning, you're going to go into the EC2 parameter store. And so here we have this generic service. In the example, it would be zg-kong-2-1/prod/db/password. You would then just go throw in your database password that you wanted in there. I typically use this pwgen to generate a random secure 16-character password for me. The other things you would have to do is if you were running Enterprise Edition is go into the parameter store as well, provide your license, the JSON snippet that would be used to start the enterprise edition, and then also your bin tray off so that you can officially download the enterprise edition. And then once you do that, you can do that within the first couple of minutes while things are provisioning, and it will come out okay. You'll then be able to log into your EC2 instances with the SSH key that you provided. And then it'll be just Ubuntu at the EC2 instance name or IP address. We do use a default master password for Postgres. And so it's highly recommended that you log into an EC2 instance or to your using your Bastion host to run these commands. And so here you can see the default password is Kong, change me now, $1. And then you would connect to the database host and then use alter user root with password and then supply your new password in there. You would then want to put that back into the parameter store. So when you provision new EC2 instances, it's going to use that instead. And then you're ready to start adding your APIs.
Sweet.
Yeah, that's really cool. Do you have plans to expand on any of this? Are you taking contributions? Are you still working on it? Do you still use it even?
Excuse me. Yeah, yes. At EA, we're already looking at we're heavily in to Kubernetes, and so the Kubernetes ingress controller is also a very attractive option to us. And just Kong as an API gateway is a very attractive option to bridge between Kubernetes and our legacy applications. And so I'm still working on this, and also happy to accept pull requests on this. So please feel free to commit back and support the project. I think what we have slated would be to support just RDS. Aurora is, an enterprise class database service that the minimum instance type is pretty hefty in terms of computational power and also cost, which may not be necessary for some environments, especially how little the Kong nodes actually rely on the database. So we're going to be adding RDS support in a future release. So that way you can toggle between Aurora and RDS for cost saving and feature perspective. And then also looking at tweaking some of the VPC settings so that if you happen to tag your subnets differently, you don't use, say, the type tag, that we could then tweak it so you could modify that setting as well, just to provide you more flexibility when you're provisioning.
Hey, hi, Dennis. Nice to see you again. Does anybody have any questions for Dennis, maybe from the core?
I'm actually curious, this is Mars, the password generation, so Terraform has a random generator in it. Is there a reason you're not using that? It's just to keep the password out of Terraform completely?
Yes, that's the only reason. I suspect that the password generation option didn't exist in Terraform when I started with this. I'm happy, again, that's like a great example of a contribution where, someone could come in and provide that. I'm also happy to go and revisit that. Because I think that's a great idea. The more that you can automate and the less you'd have to manually go in and change things, the better. That's the whole DevOps principle. So I think that's an excellent thing to add. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? I do have a couple of questions for you, Dennis, if nobody else has a question. maybe not. I was wondering, Dennis, how was your experience with the health checking of Kong, and did you have any trouble? Did you find the health check endpoints, status endpoints, or how did you implement your health check in general with Kong?
That's an excellent question. This came
right.
So let me go back in here. Sorry, my internet connection is not the best here. So this happens when we use Cloud Init to provision the EC2 instances. And so down here at the very bottom, I actually do kind of a cool trick with that. What I do is when the instance comes up and I see that the status is running, I actually create a Kong endpoint for health checks that loops back to the admin interface such that I don't have to expose the admin interface beyond local hosts, but I can then just connect to a Kong endpoint that's called /status to enable health checks on load balancers. And this is even, I think, a little cooler and more complex when we get into Enterprise Edition, because with RBAC enabled, you would then have to use like a username or a token in order to get access to that. And so what we do is create that, same status health check, but we use the Request Transformer Advanced plugin to add in a Kong admin token for the monitor user. And above, you can see that we create that monitor user with just read access to /status. And so after these are created, you can then go back and say enable IP whitelisting so that only the subnets for your load balancers have access to further restrict that endpoint as well.
It's a cool trick. Nice. That's
Thank you. Yeah, so it's like I'm leveraging Kong to make Kong work, which I think is a really cool aspect about Kong. You can do a lot with it.
Dennis, if something gets unhealthy with that, is there a chance that your health checking can not be accessible anymore because Kong is unhealthy?
Well, that's exactly it. Is if Kong is unhealthy, then you really don't want it to serve requests. And so it's a great way to make sure that Kong is healthy is that you loop back to that admin API to get the status. And if the cluster is unhealthy, then that would fail. If Kong can't serve the request, it would fail. And so in either case, you really don't want that node serving any traffic. The load balancer is then going to pull it from service, which is the right thing to do. And then your auto-scaling group would replace that instance.
Cool.
And do you check
automatically for you?
Do you you probably are aware? Do you check for the fact there is a boolean in the status response that tells you if the database is reachable or not? Because Kong has resilient mechanisms in which it will be still considered somewhat healthy when the database cannot be reached because most of the values will be already cached by the proxy. So Kong can still proxy requests. And so you probably want to implement different levels of severity of what is considered up and what is considered down when, say, the database is down, but Kong still has values in its cache, or when the database is down and even /status endpoint maybe cannot even respond anymore.
No, that's absolutely correct. Right now, as it stands, this really only checks for that 200 status okay. We could obviously do like a deeper ping or a deeper health check in order to create different levels of severity with that. And I think that would be a great thing too, to just leverage CloudWatch. So if you had an instance where the database is unreachable, you could then notify the admins of that, but the Kong cluster still is up and healthy and running with cache values in the interim.
Well, that's great. Thanks for answering and for showing us your trick. Very nice.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we'll take note of that.
Yeah, and while we're in this file, it's also, I think, good to note that I really built these Kong clusters to be enterprise level, enterprise feature rich. And so you can see in here that we're leveraging Runit, which is a process supervision for Linux that basically always makes sure that Kong is running. So if the Nginx daemon crashed, Runit would, or SV would go in and automatically restart it for you. It's a process nanny. And then it's also, logging all the output into log files, and then we rotate those nightly for you. So we keep 14 days worth on disk and rotating those to make sure that you're not filling the disk as you go. I've also written a Kong, a Splunk log for Kong that enables you to send basically the HTTP logs to Splunk. And this way you can, have a longer term retention policy and get those rich metrics that you get from HTTP log versus just the Nginx logs for that. And really it's built on the HTTP log. The only difference is we use a different serializer so that the timestamp is at the front of the payload so that Splunk can parse that and use it in its indexing, and also handle the token for the HTTP endpoint.
That's interesting. So that's neatly done. And one of our plans would be that has been for a long time. Ideally, we get to it eventually, would be to give the ability to provide custom serializers for log plugins so that you could just upload a serializer as some chunk of Lua code, and then you can apply different serializer per transport plugin, right? So HTTP log plugin or TCP log plugin are different transport modes. And so your serializers will just extract whatever data it desires, especially thanks to the PDK, the plugin development kit. That should be a lot easier. And then serialize it in JSON, in any binary format, anything, and then send it over a transport plugin. That would be very, very neat. But I understand the need to fork the plugin currently. And very nice that you're using prepare and the Nginx binary directly. That's some power usage here. Very nice. That's great.
Yeah, try to adhere to some best practices there. Definitely want to make it easy on myself. Like, again, when you start to go off and kind of do your own thing, it's important to make appropriate decisions about how and where you fork off from mainstream. And so, like with the status endpoints for the health checks, I think I could have gone in and done some work on the Nginx side to make that work. But then, you're then looking at a custom nginx.conf. And again, I wanted to keep things as vanilla as possible while still providing people a lot of flexibility and power in that regard. Yeah, thank you. Read a lot of Kong documentation to, make sure that, this adheres to some best practices in terms of administration and security. And then to touch base on what you were saying about the logging, I think that's an excellent idea because if I were just able to provide a custom serialization for the log, I could then probably get away with creating a Kong endpoint for logging to then add my Splunk token in the headers and pass it on that way. So again, using Kong to deliver Kong logs. And it would eliminate the need for all that custom plugin work.
Yeah, that would be great. We'll take note as well. Yeah.
Sweet, cool.
Very
nice. Just as a last note, Dennis, if people have lingering questions from you, how would you like them to get a hold of you?
I think that probably the best way is just dennis.kelly@gmail.com. Or if you were to say submit issues to the GitHub project for this as well, I'll have access to that.
Great. Awesome. Thank you very much. This is very cool. So next up we have Mars. Dennis, I think if you stop sharing, perfect. Then Mars, you should be able to start sharing.
All right, sounds good. Here I go.
Woo.
Okay. Am I visible?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So, hi, Kong community. I'm Mars. I work at Salesforce Platform, which acquired Heroku back in 2010. And I joined the company about 3.5 years ago. And so I'm just going to dive right in here. So first of all, I just want to mention Heroku, if you don't know, is a platform as a service. It's one of the kind of original platform as a services that makes it really simple to go from code in a Git repository and you essentially push it to our platform. And we manage the build, the runtime, the operations, patching the stack, like all kinds of stuff. So it makes it really simple to build your business and focus on what's unique and important about your apps. So why Kong on Heroku? So when you deploy an app, Heroku automatically routes traffic to the instances of the app. But there's very limited custom configuration. You can attach custom domains and you can attach custom certificates. You can also use our automated certificate management, which actually uses Let's Encrypt on the back end. But we have a lot of enterprise clients that have very sophisticated architectures. And we hear API gateways requests for this kind of technology frequently. So back in late 2015, I was asked to begin experimenting with API gateways on our platform. And Kong was one of the forerunners of, at the forefront of some of our choices there. And so did a huge amount of work for several months. We kind of hit a lot of difficulties though. Kong back in the 0.5, 0.6 time range was made up of a number of different processes and used the network for clustering, and really didn't work so well on our platform. And so we ended up suspending this experiment in the spring of 2016. But thanks to, I would like to think that thanks somewhat to my feedback, our feedback, and a lot of amazing work at Kong, it's evolved. And earlier this year, came back to it, and we now have something that works really gracefully on Heroku. So what is the app itself? It lets you deploy Kong instantly. You don't have to think about code or configuration off the top. It even works on our free tier. Now that can't handle much traffic and you can't scale it when it's free, but it lets you very quickly spin up Kong and start configuring it and see how it will work for you. One of the features of our Heroku Kong app is that we automatically enable a secure proxy to the Kong admin. So this is as documented in the Kong docs itself. And I'll show you more about that. But basically, when you deploy this app, you get a /Kong admin endpoint, which is the admin interface secured with a unique secret token. And on Heroku, it's really simple to scale up and scale down both the number of instances, or dynos as we call them, and the type of database, size of the database. And then once I show you the Heroku Kong app, or actually, why don't I go ahead and step over and I'll show you that. So here is the GitHub repo, Heroku Kong. And let's see here. So this is our deploy to Heroku button. Just wanted to give you a demo of how this works. So I'm going to call this, so I'm going to name my app community call Kong. I'm going to put it in my personal apps. And there's nothing else to configure here. The admin key will be auto-generated. So I'm going to say deploy. And we should see it begin to do its work pretty quickly here. So there's a number of different ways you can deploy apps to Heroku. You can do it through these button deploys. The more conventional way is to have source code, and you actually use git push Heroku master. And it pushes to the Heroku git, and then Heroku will build and deploy your app. So the build is almost finished. As you can see, this is a 19 megabyte slug. So that means that our application, as it is sent to the different servers, is just under 20 megabytes, which is a great low profile app. And then what it's doing now, as it runs scripts and scales dynos, this is where it's actually setting up the database. So we have some database seeds to set up that secure admin API. Let's give it just a moment here. I'll actually, let's see here. So while this is continuing, I'm going to interleave these two examples. So this should be done pretty soon, but I'm going to step back over here, and the next demo I want to show you is a more sophisticated one, and this is using Terraform in order to deploy microservices on Heroku with a Kong gateway that's all configured via Terraform. So we actually will use an open source Kong plugin, or no, sorry, Kong plugin or Kong provider for Terraform to actually configure the routes and everything. And yeah, so I will give that demo here. Okay, so this has finished deploying. I'm going to step over to manage the app. And if you're familiar with Kong, you'll know that this message means that Kong has been deployed and nothing is configured. So that's all it takes to get Kong running. And then the auto admin API, if I was to go look at my settings, reveal config vars, here's my admin key. I'll copy that, hide them again. And let's see here. Actually, I don't want to take up too much time because the Terraform example is actually going to show you this working live. So anyway, that's all it takes to get Kong working on Heroku. Very simple deploy. Now let's go to this GitHub repo, which is in Heroku examples. And here it is. And so this one, much like what Dennis just demonstrated, is actually a Terraform config. And this is the architecture of what it actually provisions to Heroku. It provisions a Kong gateway app. And then my sample is just a single microservice, but it of course could be more of them. So I'm going to step over to my terminal now. And I've got this preset Terraform apply. So I'm going to run this, and you'll see we're going to create 14 resources. And those resources are a Kong Postgres instance, a Kong app, an app that I've called Wasabi, which is just a sample, microservice app. And then these are pieces we use, components we use to deploy on Heroku. So we have releases for each of these apps, and we have formations, which represent the number of instances and their sizes. And then we have the slug, which is the code that Kong is made of. And then here we have another slug. So in Kong's case, it's called Kong. And for this Wasabi app, it's actually a Node.js app. So if I start this provisioning, So as Dennis was alluding, Terraform is pretty amazing. If you're not using it yet, highly recommend you check it out. This should do a complete provisioning in just a minute or two. So as you can see, it's making the apps. So part of what's amazing about Terraform is that the actual configuration, if I was to go to the main TF file here, you'll see that we're using the Heroku provider and this open source Kong provider, and then this random provider in order to generate a random admin API key. And so here it provisions the Heroku app, and it sets this admin key on the app, the Postgres instance, the code, the slug, and same thing with the microservice app. And then here's, sorry, let me go back to show you. Right, so when Kong is provisioned, we actually use what's called a local exec provisioner. And when it's provisioned, we actually run this health check against Kong so that we don't try to configure Kong, Terraform won't try to configure Kong until it's actually booted up. And so once it's booted up, then we have these few resources here, this Kong service, which will point at that Wasabi app URL. We have the route, which is going to be /wasabi on the Kong proxy. And we have this Kong plugin, which inserts our internal API key on the backend request. So if we look, okay, it has provisioned. So that's great. We love it when it works this easily. So the first thing I want to show you is what happens if I try to go directly to that microservice app. I'm going to hop over to, okay. So as you can see, this is actually like a 401 response, and it's saying that it's missing the internal API key. So the microservice that's deployed can't be accessed unless you go through Kong. So now if I go to the service URL, which is through Kong, you'll see that there's my fun little Wasabi time backend app. And so, of course, in this configuration, you can have far more than just one backend app, and you can configure all your routes, and it will all come to life as a single Terraform config. And this is really, you know, it's a huge part of it is thanks to Kong's really pure API-driven behavior, which is really a blessing for the way it works on our platform. And then, of course, part of what's great about Terraform is that as easy as it is to create something, you can destroy the whole thing. And so here, we can tear it all back down almost instantly. And then those resources aren't used anymore. So basically, we have enabled Kong as this app that integrates programmatically with other apps on our platform. It's a really great story. This has just really happened over the summer. And so we're very interested in getting more feedback and seeing what you folks think about it. So that's it.
Nice.
Super cool. What questions does everybody have for Mars?
I don't even hear crickets. Okay, well, if anybody is interested in reaching out to me, that Heroku Kong repository on GitHub, that's a great place to start. If you file issues there, I'm the main person who'll be paying attention to it these days. And then you can also reach me at mars.hall@salesforce.com.
Mars, I had a question I was about to ask. So what improvements do you envision for your deployment option? Like, do you have any specific ideas in mind on how you could improve it or the community could contribute improvements? Hey,
Well,
maybe even on the Kong side, who knows?
yeah, I mean, really, at this point, we've gotten to a point that it works really smoothly. So like with that Terraform demo, of course, I'm using the Kong provider, which is made by this British fellow named Kevin Holditch. I don't know if y'all are familiar with him, but it seems like he's done an amazing amount of work. He made a whole, Go client for Kong and then built the Terraform provider for it. And it kind of seems like he's kind of going it alone right now, and it's kind of falling behind in a few places. And so it would be great to see if maybe he could get some support from y'all, or if you could adopt his module as like a first-class Kong-owned kind of open source thing. And along those lines, actually, I guess the main improvement I'm looking at is, of course, upgrading to Kong 1. So this is Kong 0.14.1 right now. And as soon as the RC1 came out, I tried, but because of the lack of database migrations, it really cramped my style on that first RC. So I didn't really do anything with it. And it's in my stack of to-dos right now to try it out. If there are any issues running one on Heroku, that's where you'll probably hear from me.
Yeah, please let us know. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, yeah, maybe a great candidate for a future community call.
Yeah, I'm gonna find him.
Very nice. Thanks for letting us know. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
We're very excited to see Heroku being back on the list of deployment options for Kong. Very excited. So it's really great news. Thank you for all your work.
Yeah, this is awesome. Thank you so much for presenting. Cool. So if no one else has any other questions, I'm going to kick it over to Thibaut, because this was a great segue into 1.0 development.
Actually, yeah, it was. Awesome. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, so we wanted to give everybody a little update orally over this call to talk about the development process around Kong 1.0. So as you know, and as we just talked about, so Kong 1.0 is, just to recap, the labeling of the stability over the last 3 years of Kong, and it's running in production into mature organizations around the world, both the Kong open source project and its enterprise edition. The first release candidate, which was announced at our first user summit in San Francisco back in September, introduced a number of changes, including migrations, just as Mars talked about, and also we consider the plugin development kit, starting with 1.0, the official way of writing plugins. And we've made a number of improvements in the admin API and the database layer with which Kong talks to the underlying Cassandra or Postgres data stores. So after a few weeks of developments and helpful feedback from the community, we announced RC2 in October. RC2 is the first release candidate that has migrations between an existing 0.14 deployment of Kong and 1.0. So Mars, to answer your question, if that is what you were looking for, RC2 should have this the upgrade path between 0.14 and 1.0. On top of that, RC2 has a few last-minute features that didn't make it to RC1, but are very important to be part of 1.0 for us. That includes HTTPS health checks, significant performance improvements in the plugins run loop. So Kong RC2, 1.0 RC2 performs significantly better than any other version before. And some very nice community contributed features, Lambda proxy integration, the pull requests that had the most +1s and little tadas from the community ever. So it was a great contribution from community members.
Was that Jeremy?
No, that was Alois.
Oh, awesome. That's so great.
Yeah.
Cool.
Including also, let's not forget the bump to OpenSSL 1.1.1, which would bring us support for TLS 1.3 very soon as well. This was a significant effort under the hood, although the result is just a one version bump, like 1.1.0 to 1.1.1 actually required a lot more effort under the hood, but it will give Kong the ability to support TLS 1.3, for which we are very excited about. So I did want to remind everybody that the upgrade path has now changed in 1.0. We have reworked the migrations, something that we've had a lot of feedback and complaints about over the last few years, right? So it was very important for us to shape a 1.0 version with very strong and robust migrations, which is what we hope we've achieved with 1.0, and we are still looking for feedback. So the new process is a two-steps process in which you first upgrade your database, your data store, in such a way that the schema supports both the old version of Kong, in this case 0.14, and the new version 1.0 RC2. And it's a pure blue-green deployment mechanism in which you would eventually divert traffic from the old to the new cluster, tear down the old cluster, and then we have the second step, which we call the finish step, which actually cleans up the database and makes it only compatible with 1.0 and onwards, right? And so the same process will be applied in future migrations. We have documented this process currently only in the announcement post for Kong, for the RC2, but it will also be documented on the website, of course, and the upgrade path on the GitHub repository. We just haven't had time yet to put that in place. There was some confusion from RC2 users, so I just wanted to remind everybody that the new migration path has slightly different comments, but eventually is a lot more robust. We have tested the upgrade from 14 to 1.0. We are still running some more additional tests to test each of our migrations, ensure no downtime on the proxy side, and make sure that everybody can upgrade to 1.0 very smoothly. And in the future, every upgrade with migrations is going to be thoroughly tested and have this new two-steps migration process, which we're very excited for. The last part of the migrations is the migration from a fresh data store, in which case we introduced a new command called bootstrap to sort of really distinguish between the new migration path that exists. So there exists the migration path from a fresh data store that is not bootstrapped, and migration paths from an existing data store. And so by making this distinction, providing very clear error messages, we hope that the usability of the migration command greatly improved, as well as its stability. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to talk about regarding migrations. I hope I haven't forgotten anything. We can have a few questions, but before, so I'm mindful of the time. Yeah, so let's talk now about what the future release candidates are going to look like. So we've planned for 2 more release candidates, RC3 and RC4. RC3 is the first release candidate that will introduce the announced service mesh feature. We are still squashing the bugs away on this one. We expect RC3 to come out about this week or next week at the latest. And we will provide as much documentation as we can in its release post, announcement post. But it will allow the deployment of Kong in the service mesh pattern and allow for raw TCP traffic to be proxied with a new way of routing traffic based on source IP and destination IP address, and deploy Kong as a sidecar, service mesh sidecar in a service mesh pattern. The RC4, release candidate number 4, is going to be the first release candidate that removes all deprecated entities, such as the API entity and various utility modules that are replaced by the plugin development kit. So again, RC3 introduces service mesh, and RC4 removes all deprecated concepts and entities from Kong. And we are hoping, according to our schedule, if everything goes well, before December, we should have 1.0 available for general use. And so 1.0 will, again, be RC4, be a general availability of RC4, which will thus remove all deprecated entities and concepts. We are also planning on releasing a version that we call 0.15, which would be sort of RC3, right? And so it will be the service mesh and all the new features introduced with Kong 1.0, but with the deprecated API entity and with the deprecated concepts and utility functions for plugins. So this way, we are hoping to provide our users in the community the most flexibility. We are hoping that the upgrade path between 14 and 1.0 and 14 and 15 is very smooth, and hopefully, if you're not ready to upgrade to 1.0 and upgrade your plugins yet, you can at least upgrade to 15, still enjoy APIs and still use the, you don't have to upgrade all of your plugins yet. And then later on, when you're ready for it, you can upgrade from 15 to 1.0. And that upgrade would just be removing the APIs entity and removing a few utilities, assuming you converted your plugins to use the PDK. So that's where we are at with 1.0 development. So again, the dates, we're hoping RC3 next week and 1.0 before the end of the month. Any questions so far? I hope I was clear enough.
Thibaut, Mars here. I was curious, the Kong migrations bootstrap, can that be run just regardless, just to like, I guess can that be run and not like damage an existing database? Do you know what I mean?
In an idempotent way, you mean?
So like, for example, for the Heroku Kong app, we automatically run migrations. And so I'm wondering, like, can Kong migrations bootstrap just be automatically run without damaging an existing data store? Or is it something where we need to like probe to figure out, do we run bootstrap or migrations?
No, running bootstrap should be harmless.
Okay.
It completely unclosed within if not exist clause, even within Cassandra. So it should be pretty harmless to run the bootstrap command. And something that I can mention about the new migration is that there is a new command. I believe it is called status. And so this command gets you not only error messages, but also an exit code that corresponds to what the next steps for your database would be. So say you have a newer version of Kong and you run status, then it tells you, you have new migrations to run. Or it tells you, you have run some migrations and you're in the process of migrating, but you haven't run the finish command yet for those migrations. So it's sort of a way to automate your migration process. Or it tells you, like everything is up to date and you don't have any pending migrations running. So you are as up to date as you could be. So both with error messages and status code. So it's also a great tool, like a great little helper to run, to figure out what you would have to do to upgrade your database or not take any actions. But Bootstrap itself is harmless. Yeah.
Great,
and
thank you.
hopefully you can test this, make sure that we didn't make any mistakes and everything, right? So any feedback, any testing is very much welcome, of course.
I will definitely do this in the next week or so, yeah.
Great. And so we've actually had quite a lot of feedback already from RC2, thanks especially to Jeremy. And I think Jeremy is on the call.
Yeah, it's been fun testing it.
Yeah. So
Awesome.
it's been really helpful. We've caught a number of issues regarding our because we've upgraded all of our bundled plugins to use the plugin development kit. So we've noticed a few things that were left over, a few misbehaviors indirectly introduced. So the plugin development kit itself is not buggy, but we've had to change some surrounding code. And we've noticed a faulty migration in the ACL upgrade, for which we haven't written the test yet, but that is still something that we're working on before RC3 and RC4. So Jeremy caught those in advance. So thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah, no problem.
Great. Okay, that's the upgrade for 1.0. I do think somebody else was asking another question in the background, or was that just background noise?
It might have been noise, but if anybody has a question, feel free to unmute and go for it.
Yeah,
or
please.
If you're not comfortable unmuting, you can also chat it into the chat.
Okay.
Cool. So the last thing that I actually had on our agenda was maybe to just briefly mention the CLA.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I actually haven't been too involved in the process. I don't know if you have, but
no, I haven't. But it's been something that the organization has wanted to put in place.
Yeah.
Hopefully, when open source projects reach a certain size and have companies are backed up by companies such as Kong Inc., contributor license agreement sort of becomes a necessary, I don't want to say necessary evil, but a necessary tool for the for the company to protect the project, right? So it is automated. You just have to, when you open a pull request, a new pull request, so starting last week, I think, all previous pull requests are unaffected and contributions, but further pull requests you will have to sign a online, in an automated fashion, a contributor license agreement. Hopefully it isn't too much of a hassle. It should be fairly simple to sign it, and your pull request will automatically be approved. There will be a tick box, especially for the contributor license agreement. So it should be minimal friction, hopefully.
Yeah. And also, if you have any feedback on the process, if it doesn't work for you, or there's anything that you have feedback on, please let us know, because it's a new process. So as with all new processes, you just never know until you try it.
Yep. Well, so far we've still received the usual number of pull requests, and we've had a number of contributors already signing it, and I do think we've already merged pull requests that had the contributor license agreement.
Awesome.
So it hasn't had any further impact in terms of contributions so far. So we're pretty happy with it.
Cool. Does anybody have questions about that? Okay.
Okay. If you open a pull request, you will see the text itself, and so you may sign it if you plan on contributing in the future. Cool.
And we hope you'll all sign it in the future.
Yeah. And also we had great contributions last month, right, with the Hacktoberfest.
Yes, we did.
I don't know if you wanted to mention that or if it's for a further call.
There is actually a wonderful blog post that Cooper wrote on it. So I would encourage everybody to take a look, but the gist of it is basically, we're over time. So, but the gist of it is basically that we had some amazing contributions to the documentation site for Hacktoberfest. We added automated tables of contents. Our formatting on our version drop-down menu got fixed. There was a lot of cleanup that happened, and it was just amazing to see all of those contributions come in. It was really, really cool. So I would encourage everybody to check out that blog for sure.
We've also had some on Kong itself, Kong core, but we value all contributions, whether they come into the project itself or the documentation. And it's been really awesome to see the documentation receiving some love. It was very rewarding to see people coming together and contributing on a number of issues that Cooper cleaned up, or issues and labeled good first issues, and that was really helpful for newcomers to come in and decide what they would be helping on. And so we do also have the good first issue labeled on the Kong repository itself. So if you want to contribute, give it a try. Hopefully they are in somewhat cleaned up, and you can find your way around there and what you would like to contribute.
Cool. Cooper, did you have anything to say about that, since you're on the call?
Just a big thanks, and a thanks in advance for all the contributions to come.
Awesome.
Great.
Sweet. All right. Well, with that, thank you everybody who stuck around for the last couple of minutes. This recording will be online. Thank you so much to Mars and Dennis for great presentations. And we will see you next month. Next month, we're moving the call up a week because it falls right in the middle of KubeCon. So we'll be moving it up to, I think it's the 6th.
Great.
Have a good week, everybody. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for everything. Thanks for joining.
Cheers.
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 Cheers.